Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute, and it is truly my pleasure today to welcome Jan Kalicki to speak on energy geopolitics after the elections, the struggle for energy security in Europe. If you'll forgive me, I just want to say a little bit, a word or two about Jan's background, but particularly as it relates to Brown and the Watson Institute. Jan Kalicki and Mark Garrison, who's sitting in the back of the room, were absolutely central to the founding of the Watson Institute. This is the 25th year of the Watson Institute, and the efforts of Mark and Jan are reflected in everything we do. Or to put it differently, if not for their efforts, we really wouldn't be here today doing what we're doing. Jan served as assistant to the president of Brown and as executive director of the Center for Foreign Policy Development. Mark was the director of the Center for Foreign Policy Development from 1985 to 1988. And the Center for Foreign Policy Development was the precursor of the Watson Institute. Let me say a few words more about Jan's background, just so that you all know it. I think you're all already familiar with Jan. In addition to playing such a central role here at Brown, Jan Kalicki has had an extraordinarily, and continues to have an extraordinarily distinguished career in public service and also in the private sector. Jan served as a member of the policy planning staff in the State Department under Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and also under Secretary of State Cyrus Vance. Jan also served as Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts. In the private sector, Jan served as Vice President of Lehman Brothers and also as Counselor for International Strategy at Chevron from 1993 to, from 2001 to 2014. Jan has also served in the Commerce Department and in the White House. Jan today, in addition to being a senior fellow at the Watson Institute, is chairman of the Eurasia Foundation. There's much more to say about Jan's career, but I think it's certainly fair to say that in addition to being extraordinarily well-positioned and, of course, qualified to talk about geopolitics, you can begin to imagine the many other areas of foreign policy and geopolitics which Jan can comment upon that I think are all in the front of our minds after the elections last week. Let me just add one other thing. After Jan speaks, I'm going to ask, and he's generously volunteered, Jeff Colgan has volunteered, faculty member here at Watson in political science. Jeff will provide a few minutes of commentary as a discussant for Jan's talk. Without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Jan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed, for that very nice introduction, and it's great to see Mark Garrison here. I remember the wonderful days that we've had at Brown in the past, and it's great to be back here at the Watson Institute. It's already been a week, hasn't it, since the elections? It's sort of hard to believe that with the tremendous earthquake that seems to have hit this country as well as the world, that it's just been a week. But this afternoon, I'd like to say just a few words about the impact of the election on energy geopolitics in general before turning to the likely most immediate test that I see coming up in Europe, where I'd like to assess the energy and the regional security challenges as well as possible solutions that we face there. First, the Trump Tremors have hit the world of energy as they have hit many other worlds, all the way from the candidate's defense of coal to his advocacy of the Keystone XL pipeline, to his call to take the oil from ISIS, to his vows to deregulate the energy sector and to cancel the Paris Climate Agreement. And Jeff, I bet you could add a few more to that daunting list. Of course, President Trump may proceed differently from the candidate, but I don't think we can count on that, and we have to be prepared for what he said he wanted to do and then see what we think about it. In some cases, I think his goals are unattainable, frankly, as in the case of his call for complete energy independence, which has a wonderful ring to it, as you listen to the rhetoric on this question. But this is a world where there's an increasingly interconnected global energy economy, and I think it's unrealistic to say there will simply be an energy island within that context. But on the other hand, shale development has made the U.S. the world's largest natural gas producer and the world's third largest crude oil producer, which gives us a significant advantage in international energy affairs, not to mention the tremendous leadership that we've been showing in the renewable energy sector. So I think there's a great deal that the U.S. can do to have an impact on international energy events. Of even greater concern is Mr. Trump's calling human-caused climate change a hoax, I'm quoting that, promising to dismantle the Environmental Protection Agency in almost every form, that's another quote, and vowing to terminate the Clean Power Plan, which is Mr. Obama's domestic climate change regulations, and as I mentioned, to cancel the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, a more limited EPA is likely to emerge, and the Paris Agreement, fortunately, is a multilateral endeavor rather than something that can be canceled unilaterally. And particularly welcome, I think, is the call to action that came from Marrakesh just, in fact, currently, as they're meeting there to discuss climate change issues. So I think we can look to a continuation of the climate change efforts, but for the U.S. to be dropping out as a leader of these efforts would be extremely damaging, in my opinion, and even more so the non-participation or the very partial participation on the part of the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, which we are. In other cases, the geopolitics of energy will have familiar contours, but they were not particularly discussed in the presidential campaign. One important example is OPEC's agreement in Algiers last September to reduce oil exports by some 750,000 barrels per day. Prior to the next OPEC meeting at the end of this month, its members in Russia are discussing just how these limits are to take effect. And there's some doubt that they'll be made to stick. If they do come to pass, however, the limits could help lift prices to a certain extent, and that would be a significant change in the oil landscape. It is in European natural gas, however, that energy geopolitics will find an immediate test. Europe can rely on a range of domestic and external sources for the other fossil fuels, oil and coal. It can develop nuclear power where France takes the lead, and renewable energy where Denmark is in a prime position. But natural gas is a growing energy source for Europe at about 24%, and Russia is the lead natural gas supplier at 37% of the total. At 327 billion cubic meters a year of natural gas imports, European demand is set to increase to 413 BCM by 2020. Moscow seeks to increase its European market share and to end its dependence on Ukraine for transiting 142 BCM a year of its natural gas to that market. There, the Kremlin seeks to substitute 2 additional pipeline systems sponsored by its state company Gazprom, to the north through the Baltic Sea and to the south through the Black Sea. In the Baltic, with Western partners NG, E.ON, OMV, Shell, Uniper, and Wintershall, Nord Stream 2 could double the capacity of Nord Stream 1, which already exists, from 55 to 110 BCM per year. And we have here the map of both the existing Nord Stream 1 and the planned Nord Stream 2 on the board there. In the Black Sea, with Turkish partner BOTAŞ, Turkish Stream, which is now dubbed Turk Stream, would have an annual capacity of 32 BCM, which could be expanded later compared to 16 BCM for the existing Blue Stream pipeline, which is shown on this map. This is in addition to the major Southern Gas Corridor project, which is shown here, sponsored by BP and scalable from 60 to 120 BCM per year to carry natural gas from Azerbaijan across Georgia and Turkey, eventually to the European market. And those will be in segments with the Trans-Anatolian segment shown in blue, and then the Trans-Adriatic taking it on to Greece and Italy beyond the Turkish front. So that will be the overall plan for the Southern Gas Corridor. Now, 9 EU member states, led by Poland, and including Croatia, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Slovakia, have come out in opposition to Nord Stream 2. Transit fees would be lost for existing pipelines, including an estimated $2 billion per year for Ukraine. The Central and Eastern European countries would continue to depend almost entirely on natural gas supplies from Russia's state-owned Gazprom, which has been suspended twice before in price and payment disputes with Ukraine. Occurring in the cold of winter, the Russian cutoffs resulted in considerable human hardship in 2006 and 2009. Overall, Nord Stream 2 has stirred very strong feelings, not just limited to the energy equation, but to the overall optics of Russian control of the natural gas going into Eastern Europe and beyond. In fact, the Polish defense minister likened the project to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so that shows just how strongly people feel in the region about this subject, particularly those in Poland. Germany, however, continues to lean in its favor, and Chancellor Merkel has said that it should be viewed as a commercial rather than a political project. Other EU states that are less dependent on Russia for natural gas have taken a lower profile in this dispute. In the latest development, the European Commission has tilted in Germany's direction by permitting over 50% of the adjoining Opal pipeline for use in off-taking natural gas from Nord Stream. The battle for European energy security extends to the southern flank as well. Two overly ambitious competitive pipelines fell earlier by the wayside, the Russian-backed South Stream and the Western-backed Nabucco. In their place came Turk Stream and the Southern Gas Corridor. The former was revived last month by Presidents Putin and Erdogan as part of an improvement in relations after Erdogan apologized for the downing of a Russian jet along the Syrian border. Beyond Blue Stream, Turk Stream and the Southern Gas Corridor can be expected to supply the Turkish market and then to further Turkey's interest in becoming a gas supply hub for the European market. Gazprom faces significant competitive hurdles, however, because the Southern Gas Corridor is already constructing the Trans-Anatolian pipeline segment, and contracts have been signed for delivery of Azeri gas, not just to Turkey, but also to Bulgaria, Greece, and Italy. Moreover, Gazprom would have to face potential gas supplies from Iran and Iraq, and then much further into the future, potentially in Israel or Turkmenistan, although that certainly is not around the corner. Turk Stream is therefore at an early stage, but Nord Stream 2 is at an advanced stage in the approval process. Before the latter proceeds further, there are other options which should be weighed. One option, which is under discussion amongst Poland, Denmark, and Norway, is a Baltic pipeline which could import natural gas from the North Sea, but this would be a relatively small source at, say, 5 to 10 BCM per year. Another option is the import of large amounts of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and that is one that has attracted a lot of attention in the discussions of the alternatives available to Europe. And that could come, in the case of Eastern Europe, either through fixed terminals, as in the case of Poland, or floating terminals, as in the case of Lithuania. Europe has already imported up to 86.5 BCM per year of LNG, and it could import more. And here the US can play an important role because of our boom in shale gas development. With our becoming the #1 gas supplier, we have become, in addition to that, a leading LNG exporter. And this year we're exporting to 11 countries, including 3 in Europe, Portugal, Spain, and most recently the UK. An early example of the positive impact of LNG is Lithuania, which after building its LNG terminal in 2014, was able to negotiate a 20% discount in its new contract with Gazprom. In addition, Lithuania and Latvia have enough storage capacity to cover their annual natural gas needs as well as those of their neighbor, Estonia. Still, another option based on the first two options is to make up for any Ukrainian deficits in Russian natural gas, both by dramatically increasing the efficiency of its use and by reversing its flow from west to east, drawing on the additional sources that become available. A step in this direction was the remarkable reduction of the direct Russian import share from 34% in 2014 to 18% last year, with indirect Russian supplies coming from Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. The energy challenge should also be viewed against a broader backdrop of regional security. Despite several efforts to implement the Minsk II agreement, the conflict in Ukraine remains unresolved after Russia's seizure of Crimea and the breakaway of Donetsk and Luhansk. Western sanctions have been applied against Russia. NATO deployments have increased in Eastern Europe, countered by increased Russian deployments across the border. The Trump victory has raised big questions here again for what might be happening to the western part of this equation. He has suggested a new partnership with Russia, which may include accepting this current state of affairs in Crimea and reconsidering the sanctions against the Kremlin. This in turn will raise new questions for the EU's planned renewal of sanctions when its leaders meet next month. If they are renewed, the sanctions will face an uncertain future beyond that point. These questions raise broader existential challenges for Ukraine and its Eastern European neighbors. For Ukraine, how far will the US and EU go in helping to restore its territorial integrity and assure its economic, including its energy security? For the Eastern Europeans, these same questions apply, but pivot also on NATO's commitment to their security. Now, in the presidential campaign, Trump made that contingent on burden sharing. There are some companies that have a respectable record in that regard, but he would like to see a lot more of that in the months to come, and that is already grabbing the attention and the debate of our NATO partners. So what are the desirable energy solutions for European security? The EU could increase its storage to a total capacity of 75 BCM. For Ukraine and Eastern Europe alike, it seems imperative to lessen their dependence on outside energy sources as much as possible. They can make major gains from greater efficiency and elimination of energy subsidies. In fact, they already are making some very significant gains with the prospect of a 40% reduction in gas imports by the year 2020, according to a Ukrainian energy efficiency plan presented to the European Union. So there's a lot that can be accomplished in the efficiency area. Coal is obviously a factor, particularly in Eastern Europe, and it can be used, but with clear environmental disadvantages compared to natural gas. Initial exploration for unconventional natural gas through fracking holds less promise than expected. Each of these countries in Eastern Europe thought that a great deal of natural gas could be obtained that way, but it seems less likely. But additional investment, certainly in renewable energy, makes sense. So there are a number of steps that can be taken to contribute to the energy security of that area. I think the biggest outside contribution, however, is from liquefied natural gas. And it hasn't escaped Gazprom's notice that LNG could cut back its lucrative European market. Should Gazprom choose to do so, it could undercut the delivered cost of US LNG. Gazprom's delivered cost is estimated at $3.50 per thousand BTU, whereas the US delivered cost is estimated at $4.30. So there is a significant difference there, and a price war is not to be excluded in the European or in other regional markets. Having said that, LNG is something that is being pursued actively. We do have the LNG terminals in Europe, including the two that I mentioned in Lithuania and Poland. And it's something that Gazprom will have to contend with. In fact, Gazprom is going into the LNG business itself. Talks are planned between Brussels and Moscow, and each of these steps can give the Europeans some additional leverage. But the main leverage, I think, comes from Nord Stream 2. Here one should acknowledge that Russian natural gas will continue to make a significant contribution. But Gazprom will be required under the European energy rules to cede complete control of the gas once it's sold and delivered. In turn, Russia should be expected to continue to supply Ukraine with a fallback to European natural gas supplies if and when the Russian supplies fall short. So that could be one overall approach that the Europeans could take to mix these energy points with the political points, which I'll be talking about in a moment. Under this approach, Nord Stream 2 would be viewed as a part of a package deal to ensure the energy security of Eastern Europe and Ukraine. There's a rough parallel in oil geopolitics from almost 20 years ago, when the US successfully reduced Russian opposition to the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline in the oil area by pursuing in parallel a joint pipeline of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium with the Russian company Transneft to carry Kazakhstani oil across Russia to the Black Sea. What was positive leverage for the CPC in the 1990s could be viewed as a model for positive leverage for Nord Stream 2 in the 2010s. Finally, the energy solutions should facilitate regional security solutions and vice versa. The Minsk II process should proceed with the return of Donetsk and Luhansk as autonomous regions of Ukraine under the necessary constitutional arrangements, while the West would continue not to recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea. The combined political and energy solutions could lead to a partial lifting of the sanctions. A full lifting of the sanctions and broader improvement in relations between Russia and the West should require resolving other outstanding issues, including, most importantly, Syria. This is much to be desired given the historically low point in relations with Russia. As the next administration surveys foreign policy opportunities, this is one of the most important that it can hope to achieve in the new year, and it is one that seems to hold promise in light of the recent phone call between Trump and Putin. So in conclusion, this look at European energy security underlines the need to view these issues on an integrated basis from both a security and an energy perspective. Oddly, until a few years ago, this integration was largely missing in the EU and the US. Now the EU is moving towards an energy union with the aspiration of a common energy policy, which it could be adopting. And in turn, the US is moving forward with the creation in the State Department of a Bureau of Energy and Natural Resources, which is a step forward on that side as well. I think that we have to look at this not only in terms of bureaucratic efforts or important organizational efforts on the part of the EU, but broader efforts to bring the resources of government together so that even though we have a State Department Bureau of Energy and Natural Resources, it makes sense, and several people have called for this, to have something like a National Security Council in the energy field, a National Energy Council with a National Energy Advisor who could help the government as a whole take the lead in the field of energy. But I think it goes to show that no matter what we do in the field of energy, we have to take a combined energy-focused approach and a political approach to these regional challenges as well as the global opportunities and challenges of the energy sector. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments.
Turn it over to Jeff Colgan.
Great. Thank you, Ed, for having me as a discussant here today. It's certainly a pleasure to do so, and I want to just acknowledge the fact that very often energy policy is one of those topics that the media gets wrong, that we often see mistakes made or false claims made, and all sorts of kind of illogical arguments get played out in the popular discourse, which is a source of endless frustration for those of us who are in energy policy. And so we are really lucky to have someone like Jan come here today who has enormous experience in the field. And for me, it's an honor to be up here with him. And I'm thrilled that he's here with us at Watson for the year. And so I've already tried to pin him down so that I can take him out and learn from him myself in the next little while. Jan covered a lot of ground, which is delightful. I want to just add a few extra points and ask some questions of him as well, if I might. So just first on the broader context of this, I think it's important, especially this week, to acknowledge that we've just had this election. We have President Trump, who's going to significantly change the dynamic between the U.S. and the European Union on a whole variety of issues. It's not energy specific whatsoever, but it looks as though a Trump administration would constitute a real disengagement in certain ways from Europe. And that, I think, matters. It's going to mean that European leaders are thinking about all of their problems, of which energy is one piece of that, in a different way than they would have under, say, a Clinton administration. The other thing that I think is worth thinking about from a contextual factor on this is that Europe itself doesn't have a whole lot of domestic energy resources. It has some. I don't want to say that it doesn't, but it imports a lot of energy and a lot of different types of energy. It does have a country, Russia, right next door to it, that does have a lot of energy resources and that is significantly affected by what social scientists call the resource curse. Right? This is a country where oil and gas is the largest economic sector in the Russian economy, and that has significant effects. If you look around the world at countries that are heavily dependent on oil exports or oil and gas exports, those governments are by and large not very well governed. They have lots of problems, both in terms of their economic volatility, in terms of the degree to which they can maintain institutions that are representative of the political preferences of their population as a whole. They tend to have more frequent domestic instability and civil wars. Hopefully we will not see a civil war in Russia, but we will see continuing, likely we will continue to see a leader in Vladimir Putin who is centralized authority and who continues to play foreign policy as a card to boost his own domestic popularity at home. And that's very common, unfortunately, in petrostates. And so these things, I mentioned these broader contextual factors, not because I'm moving away from the energy question at all, but rather because it's important to understand to the extent that we see energy disputes in the next however many years, and even the ones that we've seen over the last 5 to 8 years, to see them within this broader context, right? And so a lot of people have focused on, okay, so Ukraine and Russia had a number of natural gas disputes where Russia would turn off the taps for natural gas and demand higher payments from Ukraine, and Ukraine would refuse to do that. In the lead up to what is now an annexation by Russia of part of what was Ukraine, Crimea, and also a kind of quasi occupation of the eastern part of Ukraine. And so to what extent was energy a role in that? And I would argue that the energy disputes themselves, the transit fee disputes or the natural gas pipelines, were more of a symptom than a cause of those disputes. But instead, we should think about energy as being really crucially important because it affects the domestic politics of each of the players. So it's not to say that energy wasn't important, but rather that the way in which it matters for international politics is that energy affects the domestic politics of individual players, which then in turn alters the international interactions between them. Okay, let me react now specifically to a couple of things that Jan brought up in his very good talk and sort of laying things out. He started with what would a President Trump mean on energy policy, and I can very much agree with the tenor of his comments in terms of what we might expect to lose over the next however many years, probably 4 years, who knows how many years. But we might see a loss of leadership on renewable energy, on climate change policy, and one thing that I think Jan would agree with but didn't mention was potentially a real shift in public research on energy technology and energy issues, which is very significant. Elon Musk gets all of the press and the fanfare for trying to work on electric cars, and that's great. I don't want to discount his role, but he very much draws upon research that was developed in universities and in federally funded research institutions that do a lot of the bedrock work that is then commercialized by private actors. And if we turn off the taps to that research, we're going to see a real loss in the leadership of the United States on that front as well. Jan described very well this discussion of pipeline politics between Russia and the United States. I want to say that to me, the way I read this, the upshot of Russia's increasingly successful efforts to have pipelines around the Ukraine is that it shifts the political leverage in the relationship between Europe, the transit countries, namely mainly Ukraine, and Russia itself. And so increasingly the political leverage associated with Europe's dependence on Russian natural gas lies with Russia itself rather than the Ukraine. And that gives, I think, Russia more of a free hand than it otherwise might have. A third point just to consider about is this tension that Jan mentioned around within the EU. A number of Eastern European countries have raised real concerns around these Nord Stream pipelines and other pipelines. And what I think that ultimately relates to is Germany as the key actor in those disputes, that it increasingly looks like Germany versus I won't say the whole rest of the EU, but large parts of the rest of the EU. And that could shape a broader conversation than just the energy one, but the larger conversation that Europe is having about integration as a whole, having just experienced Brexit this summer, or I should say the vote on Brexit in this summer. It's sort of unclear whether and how Brexit will happen in the longer term, but nonetheless, a real rise, or at least an apparent rise, in the discourse around fracturing the European Union, with Marine Le Pen in France, with Hungary and Poland and others looking to de-integrate or disintegrate the Europe. And so, European project. And so there's a real question here about how Germany will respond, and not just on the energy questions, but more broadly. And there are headlines this morning about how Germany is rethinking its self-defense policy, its military presence, and in light of Trump's apparent move away from Europe. And that's something that I think is going to, all of this is connected, right? It's going to, that move to rearm or to increase its defense spending could be seen by other European countries in various ways. One could imagine other European countries looking at it and saying, great, you know what? Europe, we're not going to depend on the US anymore. Germany's on our side. We're going to need this, and we're all in this project together. But you could also imagine a very different read on that question where we think, oh no, we've played this video before. We called it 1914, we called it 1939. When Germany rearms, this should alarm the rest of Europe in very significant ways. And so how Germany manages its political image and its legitimacy with the rest of Europe, I think is going to be a really significant topic for the next little bit. I realize I'm going a little bit longer than I intended, so I will just say two more things and then I will shut up before Ed gives me the cane to stop. One is a sort of a kind of micro level question for Jan, and just that I'd like him to comment on the idea, and you mentioned that the prospects for fracking in Eastern Europe were at one time held quite high. And that this was a promising geology for fracking technology, and that we would expect as a matter of time and discourse that the market would do what it does, and that it would export technology from the United States around the world, and in particular to places like Poland or Bulgaria or whatnot. And Jan pointed out that actually the sense that that's going to happen has really dimmed in the last few years. And so I would love you to comment, if you would, on why you think that that's happened. And does that have to do more with an updated sense of the geology, or is that an updated sense of the above ground factors? Which one of those has changed more? Is it the below ground or the above ground stuff that's mattered more? And last, I'll just say, call attention to one factor that Jan didn't mention that I think shouldn't be lost in these discussions, which is the move the decision that Germany took a few years ago to move away from nuclear energy as a fuel source for its electricity. And that decision was enormously consequential, has received very little attention in the press, but I think has led to really perverse policy decisions since then, right? So part of the move was, we're going to move away from nuclear energy for environmental reasons, and guess what we're going to do as a consequence to that? Well, we still want to generate electricity, and so we'll do so by burning more coal. Right? And so coal has seen a real rise. Coal consumption has gone up in Europe, and therefore greenhouse gas emissions associated with the German electric sector has gone up as well. And that, to me, is sort of the height of perverse energy policy decisions. And that kind of thing needs to be ironed out, and it needs to be a part of an international discussion, not just a national discussion, about how we get serious on climate change. So let me stop there and thank Jan again for his wonderful comments.
Well, thank you for those great comments. Appreciate it, yes. Just to your question, Jeff, about the fracking in Eastern Europe, my sense of it is it's not the above ground factors so much as two other factors. One, the geology, which was not as proved out to be not as promising as people had expected when they first looked at it. And secondly, the commerciality of it, comparing the commercial gain of moving with the more doubtful geology in Eastern Europe compared to the commercial gain in other parts of the world. Okay. So that is that, as opposed to the political factors, which I don't think daunt the majors that much.
Okay.
They're used to political factors.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll migrate back down and moderate for questions for both Jan and Jeff.
Let me turn this off.
Any questions? Tony? Yeah. We'll work the way around the room.
Two questions, one with a comment. The first and easier one, I guess, is can you give us some idea of how fast the southern pipeline will be completed? And is gas actually going from Azerbaijan to Italy now?
No, it is not. Yeah, it's in segments, and the overall plan is to go from now until 2022, something like that, with the emphasis to start with on getting to the Turkish side with the Trans-Anatolian pipeline, and then connecting up into the European. There's an interesting footnote on that, by the way, which is that the European Union has rules which make it possible for Gazprom to have part of the Trans-Adriatic capacity, so that whereas the European rules have been used as leverage against Gazprom in the north, Gazprom can use them as leverage to get access to the Greek and Italian markets in the south. Interesting footnote there.
Okay, but so there is a possibility of a substantial relief of dependency on the northern pipeline from the southern one in the immediate future, right? Or
Yes. The question about the southern one is that the market, the immediate market for the gas in the south is more problematic because you have the southern gas corridor, which is the BP initiative,
right,
which is the major thing. Then you add to that the Turk Stream volumes, and then you add to that the other volumes from other countries. Where will this go? It has to rely on interconnection, which is a very important point, in fact, to keep in mind in thinking about the European gas market, is that, just because you bet the gas into the south doesn't mean that it automatically lands in the north. You have to have good interconnections that are built up to do that.
Yeah, I thought Italy was one of the most dependent energy countries in Europe, so
Yes.
that they would, but My second question is more of a comment. My reading of Minsk, the Minsk Accords, is that they were signed under duress, and that if you get most Ukrainian officials in a back room and ask them what they think ought to be done, they'd happily see it given away. I mean, Lugansk and Donetsk. Politically, that can't be said now, but I'm sort of willing to bet that if there was a clear deal that guaranteed the security of the rest of Ukraine, that Donetsk and Lugansk would be happily given over to Russia on the grounds that they're a poison pill otherwise. And I'm wondering whether there's been any, in strategically thinking about what could be done, instead of the West insisting on Minsk being upheld, which I think the Ukrainians are as nervous about as, or as reluctant about, more reluctant about than the Russians. Whether one might be able to do more in terms of structuring a deal that was sustainable. Does that make sense of the question?
You know, it's a very good question, and I think those are poison pills in a way, but the solution to that thus far advanced is to give them a very high degree of autonomy.
Right, which is exactly what.
And not get too deeply involved in those very difficult areas. For Ukraine to actually acknowledge explicitly what they may feel privately, I think is perhaps a step too far. So that, you know, the framework would still be one constitutionally where those areas would be part of Ukraine, even though they're very autonomously part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that's going to happen because of the way the constitutional provisions are written gives them the rights to resources and claims on taxes and so on that just won't happen politically. And I'm not sure that if Ukraine wasn't guaranteed a safe position, they wouldn't happily give it away. That's the dangerous road to go down, but.
Right.
Yes.
I have a question about Afghanistan, actually. When the U.S. first occupied Afghanistan, the U.S. Geological Service published maps that indicated that Kabul sat right over a major undeveloped source of natural gas. And I recall conversations back then that talked about an Afghan pipeline to supply Western Europe that would bypass dependence on Russia. And I guess I'd like to hear what you have to say about that, because it seems in a geopolitical context of the kind you're talking about, it makes sense to talk about Eurasia once Syria is resolved. And I also, just speculatively, wonder if you'd talk about whether or not that helps explain why Russia inserted itself into Syria, because that's part of the path of the pipeline.
Well, the Afghan resource, USGS identified it as potentially interesting commercially. But I don't think anybody has done enough by way of exploring that because of the conditions on the ground to really be able to definitely confirm that. And if it were to be available, there would be closer markets to Afghanistan to consider, especially the Indian market. If you're looking at one of the long-standing proposals in this area is to carry Turkmen gas to Pakistan and India. It was called at one point the peace pipeline because of the obvious political problems that one faces in talking about cooperation of that kind with the Indians and the Pakistanis. But both the Indian and the Pakistani government have given their support for this. And if that gas is to come someday from Turkmenistan, it could come arguably even more closer from Afghanistan itself. I have not heard of any connection between the Afghan side of things and the Syrian side of things in terms of Russian thinking about, you know, what to do in Syria. I have not come across that.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. We generally see European energy independence or potential independence as something desirable. certainly from the point of view of US LNG producers, but also in many parts of Europe, for instance in the European Commission. But I wonder whether European dependence on Russia might not have its benefits too. So certainly economic, in a sense that it's much cheaper than importing LNG gas from the US, as you mentioned in your talk. Second, it does give us leverage on Russia if we buy most of their stuff. And Russian public revenue is very much dependent on rich Western European countries buying their gas from Russia. And third, as Jeff mentioned, petrostates tend to be unstable. So if the Western European revenue source for Russia, and Putin himself, falls off the cliff, what does it mean for Russia's political system and also for its foreign policy once this leverage is entirely gone and this source of constraint for Russia?
I think that's really well argued, and I think that the Russians have as much interest in the European market as the Europeans because of their dependence on the Russian supply to that market. So that is why in constructing these possible solutions, I had in mind giving significant room to the Russians for Nord Stream 2. I mean, from the point of view of Eastern Europeans, no, we shouldn't do that. We should be relying entirely on other sources and not increasing our dependence on Russia. But from the point of view of Europe as a whole and its relationship with Russia, I think a package which does take into account a continuation of Russian energy supply, which is very much in both sides' interest, but connects it to a political context, is the right way to go, especially at this time where there's a possibility of an improvement in relations. But I very much buy your argument that the Russians have a need for the European market. One counter-argument to that, by the way, is China. As you know, the Russians and the Chinese have come up with a major gas deal, which is still not moving forward in a very big way. But the argument is that the Russians can, send their gas to the Chinese market if they don't go to the European market. I think the Russians are sufficiently clear-eyed about this, realizing the Chinese are tough bargainers on price, and that they really do need a market to the west as well as to the east. So, they have capacity, an unallocated capacity right now of 100 BCM of gas per year. So that is a very large amount of gas that they would like to dispose of, and they are not doing so. And wherever there's a market, I think they'll go for it.
Can I just add, Gunnar, it's a great point, and I'm glad you bring it up. And I think that relationship between Europe and Russia is two-way, and it's complex, and the effects of what's happening in Russia right now have yet to be sort of fully felt in either Russia or Europe. And but what I mean by that is that a petrostate is very much sensitive to large fluctuations in the price of its major product, and for a number of years now, Russia's main product has either been rising or high, right, until roughly from 2003 to 2014, with a blip in 2008, 2009. But mostly it's been good times, and we're now experiencing, of course, the other side of that pendulum swing, and often I think people expect countries to kind of turn on a dime, but in fact economies don't do that, as we know, and the full brunt of low prices on Russia's economy, that's going to take time to really show the full effects of that, and potentially it's quite dangerous in the sense that it's destabilizing economically, maybe even politically. I'm not sure about that, right? It is not an uncomplicated relationship between how an economy is doing and how its politics are doing, right? There's lots of other factors going on, but I think that relationship is something to keep an eye on in the future between, and even in terms of how do we think of Germany's position? We think about, well, what's happening in Russia and how that affects the rest of Europe.
Questions? I have a quick question. So I have a question about longer-term technology trends in continental Europe. So there have already been pretty substantial investments in renewables, Germany, of course, Spain, across continental Europe, in both wind and solar. And so I guess there are a number of ways to see that. One, I mean, it still drives the need for baseload power, and if nuclear is off the table, maybe coal, but coal not particularly sustainable unless there's carbon capture and sequestration. So maybe that just creates more imperative for gas, for baseload power. Well, not ideal for all kinds of reasons, but maybe the longer term trend is on continental Europe, innovation in storage, and that Germany and others lead the way, and along with the Chinese and plenty of other people who are trying to innovate on that front. So I know it's impossible to predict the future, but how might a company think about this, or the governments think about the possibility of either renewables and climate constraints leading to much deeper reliance on natural gas, or maybe just removing fossil fuels from the picture altogether, say across a couple of decades?
Well, if you ask, that's a great question. If you ask the commercial players how they view this, more and more, I was just looking at an interview with Bob Dudley, the head of BP. They're saying that renewables is very much something to pursue, but at the same time, it's not surprising that Dudley would say this, but at the same time, and I think he's right, the fossil fuels will have a significant proportion of the overall energy mix looking forward. So the question is how to push the renewables so that you rely less certainly on the coal factor, which is very disturbing for the reasons that Jeff mentioned. And use the gas more by way of base load and covering those times when the wind isn't happening and the sun isn't shining. So I think it's a combination. It's not either or.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that, well, two things I would add. One is just that the capital stock that we're talking about in these industries has such a long lifeline that even though the technical inventions need to happen, and we hope they happen as fast as possible, if I'm a corporations, I might say the right things on green technology, but my expectation is that at least as far as what's foreseeable from a corporate perspective, which can't be much more than about 10 years, I still see an energy picture 10 years from now that's not that different from what it is today, right? Will there be rise in renewables? Absolutely. But will coal or natural gas or oil have gone away? No chance of that, right? That I think that will still be a really significant factor. The second thing that I would add to that is just, and my poor class has heard me say this like 17 times, so forgive me for those of you who are in my class, but to distinguish, and this something gets lost in the public discourse around energy, to distinguish between oil, which is used for transportation, and all the other fuels which are used for electricity. And those are two different things, and the technology could shift in one of them and have almost no effect on the other, right? And vice versa. And so those are really separate markets, even though Jan and I are both energy guys and we like to think about them all in one basket, they are quite different.
Right.
Well, I would just add, though, it will be interesting to see if we do really see electrification of the transport sector. That also has implications for storage, obviously, because everybody's going to be driving around a bunch of storage devices. So we'll see. And I'll just add, from my perspective, as somebody who also does some work in energy, but in China, it's remarkable how quickly infrastructure with very long time horizons has been switched, particularly in power generation, because coal ain't politically desirable. The burning of coal in certain parts of China and switching to gas, not terribly tricky. For baseload power has happened much more rapidly than anybody thought. Switching to an electrified transport sector is a different kettle of fish, for sure. But, well, we'll see.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say, as you both suggested, in the near term, it's not likely going to be the USA that will be leading the charge on any of these transformations. Other questions? Yes?
So you talked about how the EU is moving more towards an energy union, and then we also talked about how there's rising discourse about the fracturing of the EU. So what implications do you think a fracturing of the EU would have on energy security, or if the fact that it's moving towards an energy union type model could have an impact on fracturings?
That's a very good and big question at this point, because the Energy Union is sort of in process of getting its act together and doing some very useful things by way of making sure that the energy planning of each of the members is dovetailed together with the overall directives that the EC is trying to produce in this area. But for them to move forward does require a degree of consensus within the union as to where it is, and you have the impact of Brexit. And you know, there's just some very big questions. In addition to that, the idea of an external energy policy is great rhetorically, but it comes down to what kinds of deals do you push with what kind of vigor in such areas as Nord Stream. So I'd say it's a work in progress, and it's a question that needs to be asked a year from now, and maybe we'll have a more definitive answer at that point.
It's a great question. Let me just add one thought to it. I mean, it's a really, really good question. I would say that on some level, the Energy Union is a technocratic project fundamentally. It's mostly bureaucrats and corporate elites that are working on this. It's not a man in the street kind of conversation. Forgive the gendered language, but that idea versus the political project of European integration, which is very much political. And I think the technocratic project fundamentally rests on the political project. And the degree to which the technocracy forgets that starts to try to move at a speed that is not in sync with the political project, then you get real problems. And that is ultimately a constraint on the degree to which there is a technocratic union.
Can we get a little more granular in terms of what's happened in the last 8 months with respect to Poland and the Baltic states versus Germany and the Northern Pipeline, and how hot and heavy those decisions have gotten?
Well, there's sort of on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, I think Poland and the Baltic states have been able to create a pause in the political discussion of Nord Stream, which allows one to talk again about where we're going. Having said that, as I mentioned in my talk, I don't think it's going to mean a cancellation of Nord Stream 2. It's going to mean a repackaging, and the question is, how is it to be repackaged in a way that advances both economic and security objectives? That said, on the other side, you have Germany, and as Jeff said, Germany is more and more of a key player in most of these areas. And it still is looking at this as a commercial project rather than as a politically driven one, which is the way the Eastern Europeans look at it. And there are some questions about commerciality for Nord Stream 2, because Nord Stream 1 isn't being used to the fullest either. Now, the reason for that is the availability of capacity beyond Nord Stream 1. It's not because the market cannot absorb the gas. But as long as the Germans are saying, let's do it, and the others to the west of Germany are not taking a very strong position, I think the Germans will be the drivers of its happening. But the Polish and the Eastern European pushback will mean that we can reformulate this to an extent which would be in Germany's interest. It's not that these broader political and economic goals for Ukraine and elsewhere don't make sense, but that people have not explicitly put together this, and this is the time to do it, given the fact that all of this now is up for grabs in terms of the relationship, not just amongst these countries, but with the U.S. and between the U.S. and Russia.
There's a hand in the back. Yes.
Yeah, I know that a lot of countries in Western Europe have had a lot of success with renewables, and thinking Germany and France especially. So is there any, anxiety in Russia about the European market becoming more dependent on renewables and kind of a collapse of their need for Russian natural gas?
I've not picked up too much concern for the reasons that Jeff and I talked about earlier, that the timeline for this is a longer-term one, for it to really invade the market space for the fossil fuels, and that when you compare natural gas with, say, coal, from an environmental perspective, there's clearly a benefit to going in the gas direction. By the way, Russia's a major coal producer as well, but you know, and for that matter, Poland and a number of others are certainly culprits here. But I think that you'll find that the renewables don't get in the way of the market access points of gas at this point.
That said, and I very much agree, to Ed's point, renewables has surprised some of the experts on this, and that consistently the International Energy Agency's projections of how much a factor renewable energy would be in the production mix of energy in Europe, it was consistently low, right? Too low, year after year after year in the last decade. And so, you know, I think it's appropriate for energy experts to have some humility in the degree to which we can forecast. I think that's sort of been proven over and over again, especially on the price side of things. You know, probably the question that Jan gets most often when he talks to reporters, certainly I get all the time, is, okay, so what's the price of oil going to be in a year? Or what, you know, is it going up or down? Tell me. And, you know, nobody has a good record on that. And so I just don't answer that question because I think humility is appropriate in these kinds of projections.
Right.
Not to belabor the previous point, but I'll do it anyway. Just the different kind of thinking that operates now when we walk around with devices in our pockets, and the automobile, among some, is increasingly being seen as just another device. It's a data device for transmitting data, and it's a battery. And so the ability, through data analytics and whatever, to use these devices, for example, when they're parked all night, and to think of them as broad and flexible and highly dispersed forms of storage, and coupling that in sophisticated ways with renewables, but also with all kinds of metering in house residential and commercial users of energy, it opens up some possibilities. But of course, like renewables and other aspects, it creates a whole bunch of problems. And you mentioned some of the problems that have been created already in Germany. But anyway, it'll be very interesting to see. Other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about how relationships with Turkey and the EU are affecting the prospects for the Turkish pipeline.
Thus far, they're not, because it's several points. One is on the Southern Gas Corridor. The contracts already have been concluded, and the construction has begun on the Trans-Anatolian pipeline segment. So that's moving forward. On TurkStream, there will have to be similar contracts included. And because of the European Union rules, the access of TurkStream to the capacity of the Trans-Adriatic pipeline will be there to a certain extent, because third-party access is one of the requirements. So that was the point I was making earlier about how in the south, Gazprom can use that to its benefit. But these are different points in terms of where they are, with the Southern Gas Corridor being already in implementation stage, whereas TurkStream is still prospective.
Clara is Italian, so we expect her to go home, join the government, and solve all of the energy dependence
Excellent.
problems in the next 10, 15 years.
That's great.
Questions? I just have a quick one. I'm curious. So nuclear, in some respects, seems dead in Europe, but it's not dead in other parts of the world.
Except for France.
Yeah, well, France, although not really growing right now in France. Finland, one plant under
Right.
construction, and it seems like a debacle. That said, nuclear has not disappeared. It's big in much of the developing world, and increasingly a number of countries, for a variety of reasons, have ambitions in that front. So what's the potential for nuclear still to play a role, or maybe an increasing role, in Europe or elsewhere?
Well, I'm not a nuclear specialist, but those that know more about this that I've listened to have the sense that nuclear is very much part of the future. That there's still, when you're looking at the climate challenges, when you're looking at the safety improvements in terms of nuclear plants, that there is a possibility there for moving forward. And there are big advocates of that, of course, and those that are totally against it. the French being one and the Germans being another.
Yeah, and I asked
Even in
the-
Germany, I think that might change over time.
That's the question.
Yeah, because the coal thing is a serious problem.
And the Russia thing.
And Russia, of course, big nuclear. Big nuclear.
So I'm a former nuclear engineer a long time ago.
Oh.
I got out of this business precisely because, nuclear is the fuel of the future and always will be, right? And it's an industry that struggled for a long time, as you know. And I think that the core problem that nuclear faces right now is that it's the markets in which it is growing are also the markets in which safety concerns are, to a certain extent, highest, right? And here I'm not talking about China, which is actually the area in which, as you know well, the nuclear is growing rapidly. But I worry more, on a personal level, I worry more about other areas of the world, including Thailand and India and elsewhere, where if you look at the Japanese experience and the mistakes that they made around their nuclear reactors, if the Japanese are getting it wrong and they have a pretty high level of technical sophistication and regulatory sophistication, then you have to worry a lot about where the other places that nuclear might grow into in terms of their markets. I think there's a real disconnect between.
Yes.
I spent 3 months this summer looking at nuclear new build projects, and I specifically looked at nuclear new build projects in the Middle East, which has the highest projects that are intended by countries themselves, but they're not doing really well because of the safety and security concerns, mostly the security concerns. So I was curious, do you think that the security concerns can be overcome easily enough? And also just the timeline for building a nuclear new build project is just really long. So do you think that we might run into similar problems as in sort of the renewable energy debate, just because building a nuclear power plant takes a lot of coordination, agreements, and security standards and technology, right? So who's going to sell the technology? Like Russia's going to be keen on it, and then the U.S. might also be keen on selling the technology, although South Korea is also now sort of getting aboard, it seems, with the technology. So I don't know if the problems we run into with nuclear might not be similar to some extent to the problems we might run into with renewable energy sources.
I get to swing at that if you want
Go
to.
ahead, yeah, I'll add something to it.
Great. So, I mean, on my view, the case for nuclear energy right now is running into a series of troubles on the commercial dimension in developed world, and on commercial and safety dimensions in the developing world. And here I'm thinking mainly of East and Southeast Asia. In the Middle East, you are then layering on a security dimension that is higher than elsewhere, than other parts of the world. And so to me, that seems like, almost like three strikes you're out, that the prospects of nuclear technology, despite the stated intentions of many of those countries, I think that the prospects are not great, which is ironic because, as you well know, and I know you've studied Saudi Arabia specifically, some of those countries are using kind of perverse fuel sources to generate electricity. Some of them are burning oil, which is something that most of the rest of the world has stopped doing. So there is sort of a logic to why they might want nuclear. But my suspicion is that the security dimensions of that question render the rest of the obstacles, collectively, they're just too much to surmount.
I would only add to that precisely because of the security overlay in the Middle East, if Iran goes in the wrong direction, then all bets are off with Saudi Arabia.
Right.
So it doesn't become a question of safety or peaceful uses. It's much more a threatening and depressing scenario that you're going to have on your hands.
Yeah, fair point.
Yes.
I actually have a quick question. I think from Russia's point of view, that's the main concern is to seek more outlets for expansion. And I just feel like with the increasing tension, there's definitely a rebalancing put down between Russia and China. So I'm just curious, like the project that Russia, and then you're just increasing its leverage against Europe or against the United States?
Well, I think that the rhetoric about the Chinese-Russian gas cooperation has outdistanced the reality, and the reality has been tempered by the fact that key questions such as pricing of the gas and the contractual arrangements long-term for the supply have not come together. In contrast, the oil supply arrangements between Russia and China have been much more practicable. It's a situation where the Chinese do not feel that they have to agree to the terms that the Russians are demanding, and the Russians have other sources right now, other markets that they can pursue, as in the case of Europe, so it doesn't become the kind of crystallizing moment where you're going to have a deal actually materialize. So that's on the gas, but on the oil, I think the prospects are much higher.
Can I just add one footnote
Yes.
to your earlier comment about the possible kind of relationship between Russian gas that could go to Europe versus could go to China? I think that's something that gets discussed a lot by policymakers and by particularly by my IR colleagues, without necessarily recognizing that a lot of the gas fields that Russia might use to supply Chinese customers are not the same fields that are commercially available for European customers. So the idea that this is sort of one big pool of gas that could go in either direction is kind of the wrong analogy to use.
Time for one. Please go ahead. No, it's all right.
Do you think that building new infrastructure in these pipelines for natural gas will further divert us from the long-term goal of being completely renewable, or of only using renewable resources? Because I know there's a lot of problems with natural gas methane leakage during the process of extracting the gas and transporting it. So, just like in the long-term.
Well, again, I think it's the way the market is developing. There are immediate requirements, as in 10 years from now, as in between now and 2050, which need to be met by a combination of oil and gas and hopefully a lot less coal. Whereas the renewables are increasing, but in order to have a major impact on the market, that'll be in the longer term rather than the shorter term. As to the problems technically that you have with the pipelines, those need to be addressed and resolved. And the Europeans put a very high premium on dealing with such issues as methane, for example, and I think that they can come up with solutions to that. Anything to that?
That's great. One final question? Well, on that note, let me thank Jan Kalicki and Jeff Colgan for really a fantastic and illuminating session. And thank you all for your great
Thank you.
questions.